welcome. Wherever you are right now, whatever the time of day, allow yourself a moment of stillness. Perhaps your head has just met the soft coolness of your pillow, or maybe the gentle creak of your chair beneath you is the only sound accompanying the quiet hum of the evening. And in this long, unhurried episode, we'll explore the intimate and quiet realm of how history's most famous figures, thinkers, rulers, creators, and rebels found their rest. In this space, there's no urgency, there's no expectation. Imagine yourself reclining beneath a canopy of stars, long extinguished, in the quiet hours when the world seems hushed. No grand empires rising or falling at dramatic pace. Instead, one measured in candlelight, tonight will drift backward gently across centuries and civilizations, tracing a curious, almost poetic path through history by way of sleep and the subtle rituals that bookended their days. You may find some of their habits strange. Others might feel oddly familiar. But as we travel through these centuries, you may notice, in the rhythm of their lives, the same quiet longing for rest that echoes in your own. This is not a tale of conquests. You're listening to boring history for sleep. From the restless pacing of Napoleon Bonaparte, from the moonlit scribbles of Leonardo da Vinci, through 5 segments, we'll explore their bedrooms, their dreams. So, rest your thoughts and let us begin. When the stars were the clock, back to a time when nightfall meant more than the end of labor. It signaled the opening of another realm altogether. In the ancient world, long before the ceaseless glow of electric lights blurred the borders between day and night, sleep unfolded under the steady guidance of celestial bodies. The stars did not just twinkle passively above. It was often segmented. Many ancient peoples observed what scholars now call the tus, a quiet wakefulness in the deep midnight, often used for reflection, intimacy. Picture the slow murmur of priests' voices, the steady drip of scented oil into lamps, and the heavy scent of myrrh clinging to the air. In such places, philosophers like Aristotle and Galen. Aristotle pondered deeply the balance between waking and sleeping, noting that even plants seemed to rest in their own way. Galen, drifting through a Roman domus, the household of a senator perhaps. The air is heavy with midday heat, curtains drawn against the brightness. Slaves tiptoe through shadowed halls. The only sound, the gentle splash of water in a garden. In the atrium, the master lies upon a low couch. Developed theories about how dreams could reveal imbalances in the 4 humours of the body: blood, phlegm, yellow and black bile, guiding physicians in their treatments. And then a second sleep, returning to slumber until the light returned. In ancient Rome, the afternoon siesta, known as the meridiatio, was common, particularly in warmer regions. Imagine the slow flicker of a torch fading into the distance, the soft echo of sandaled footsteps vanishing into sleep. Our next journey will take us into the courts and chambers of the medieval world, but by scripture, bells, and superstition. Courtyards quieted under the weight of noon. In this pattern, night was not a void to be passed through. It was a layered, sacred rhythm. They served as guides, as clocks, and as companions. The wealthy slept, in individual rooms, but in rural villas or among common people, sleep was communal. Families huddled together in rooms shared with livestock. The body warmth of many sustaining comfort. Sleep wasn't simply a means to escape fatigue. It was often treated as a delicate interplay between the body, the heavens, and the divine. The rhythm of their lives and their nights followed cycles we can barely feel today, masked as we are by constant illumination and digital distraction. The sleep of pharaohs was not merely a bodily necessity, but an act of spiritual governance. Imagine a grand chamber of polished stone, moonlight filtering through narrow slits, casting thin silver lines on alabaster floors. And as night descended, and silence, once again, so sacred, in fact, that temples were constructed solely for the purpose of divine dreaming, known as incubation temples, in places like Abydos and Luxor, common folk and nobles alike would lie upon stone slabs, sometimes for nights at a time awaiting a vision, a whisper from the gods. A pharaoh sleeps atop woven linens, their dreams watched closely by scribes. Sleep was not a block of unconsciousness to be survived before the next day. In the fertile valleys along the Nile, the ancient Egyptians believed that dreams were doorways to divine realms. Sleep was a sacred act. These sleep rituals were often preceded by bathing, anointing, or the soft chanting of hymn to the west. But sleep was not only a topic for the lofty minds of philosophers. It was a structured part of daily life. Imagine yourself now. Sleep spaces. There is something deeply human in these arrangements. Sleep as a shared activity, a moment of vulnerability and restoration in both Egypt and Rome, yet beneath it all, waiting quietly beneath the skin of our modern lives. As we leave this first segment behind, the sleep of pharaohs and priests, divine rest and sacred dreams drift now further into the warm folds of ancient time, where the sun reigned as a god, and dreams were seen not as idle visions, but messages carefully wrapped in the language of the divine. Picture the banks at twilight, reed grasses bending in the hush of evening wind. Perhaps Ramesses the Great. It is an audience with the gods. Common Egyptians, too, could access the divine through sleep, ritual cleansing with water from the Nile, anointment with oils, quiet chants offered to the gods. Entire scrolls and fragments from the Ramesside period describe how to read the symbols of dreams. A snake crossing the dreamer's path meant renewal. A river rising in a vision foretold abundance. Each image, each detail held meaning, embraced. Their sleep was part of their discipline, as necessary as fasting or purification. In chambers behind the sanctum, they slept sparsely, sometimes communally. It is said that some even kept dream journals on papyrus, carefully noting their visions. Let us step back. Let the wind erase our footprints in the sand. Ahead lies the marble colonnades and lively debates of Athens and Rome, where sleep, while still sacred to some, sharing them only with trusted interpreters. The gods, they believed, did not speak plainly. Their messages required. It cloaked the city, and in that stillness, imagination opened its doors, where rest was seen not as a surrender of productivity, but as a portal to revelation, where the silence of night was not empty, but filled with meaning. They would lie on mats, or sometimes slabs of warm stone. Some might sleep in complete silence, others within hearing of ritual flutes or the slow, cyclical beating of drums. Sounds not designed to stir, but to settle the mind into the rhythm of eternity. In a practice called incubation, they would make pilgrimages to temples dedicated to healing gods, Serapis or Imhotep, and sleep within sacred enclosures, hoping to receive cures, instructions, or The act of sleeping in the temple was not one of indulgence, but of deep intention. His dreams are considered visions. They will be recorded by scribes. Upon waking, if the god spoke in riddles, decoding symbols, some dreams might determine offerings, construction of monuments, in ibis and scarab. The night was never merely absence, but not in a morbid sense. The Nile cycles, the harvesting times, the flooding. Farmers might retire early, a dozing near dusk, a deeper rest, a brief waking, to reflect or even pray, followed by sleep. Again, until the faint light of Ra-S return touched the river. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end, it was transition, and so too was sleep. One returned from it. It was a place of mystery, a second life. The room is vast, yet hushed. Its grandeur, not overwhelming, but solemn. The walls are painted with scenes from the Book of the Dead, their meanings known only to initiates and scholars of the afterlife. Low-set lamps burn thick. The air is heavy with the scent of cedarwood. The bedding is fine, linen spun tightly, cool to the skin, even in the pressing heat. Attendants withdraw in silence as the pharaoh reclines, leaving only shadows and the quiet thrum of his breath. The sky brushed in muted indigos. A procession of priests walking slowly through temple corridors, each step deliberate, echoing gently on worn sandstone. Their arms cradle linen and oil, tools not of battle, but of rest. This is the world of ancient Egypt. Ritualized it, the Nile wind softly, mirroring the quiet breath of a sleeping world. In this ancient realm, sleep served more than the physical body. It was understood to be a kind of crossing, a liminal space between the earthly and the eternal. The most powerful among them, gods in human form, slept not merely to recover, but to commune with the forces that ruled creation. Imagine now the bedchamber of a pharaoh. Sleep, for him, is not escape, but it wasn't only kings who sought guidance in dreams. Before such a night, the seeker would prepare dream manuals. Yes, such things existed, were used to interpret these nocturnal journeys. And in this culture where the divine was everywhere, in sun and flood, sleep was, in many ways, a mirror of death. Outside the palace, in this slower world, darkness was not feared. The high priests of Karnak, too, observed strict routines of rest. It is remarkable to reflect on a world where the unconscious was so honored. As the stars turn again over the desert, ancient Greece and Rome, and the geometry of sleep, now the desert air gives way to a cooler breeze, and the distant silhouettes of olive trees tremble in moonlight. You are walking slowly through the low hills outside Athens. Philosophers spoke of it not as a biological event, but as a puzzle, a phenomenon both necessary and suspicious. Why must a man sleep? What happens to the soul in slumber? Families might gather around a low fire before sleep, eating olives, figs, or barley cakes. Bedding was simple. Mats on the floor or low wooden couches with woolen blankets. In warmer months, sleeping outdoors was not uncommon, on rooftops, under the open sky. What do dreams mean? The last murmurs of conversation dissolving into silence. Many visited the temple of Asclepius. Writers like Pliny, Seneca in particular, a Stoic philosopher, advised moderation, to wake early, to avoid excess in both sleep and food, and to reflect each evening before bed on one's actions during the day. Thick curtains might separate the room from the main hall. Galen, whose influence lasted well into the medieval world, believed that sleep restored balance to the humours, too much or too little, where sleep, in its various forms, was accepted as part of a thoughtful, cyclical life. He recommended sleeping on the right side. The ancient world held sleep. The heartbeat of the empire slows, then switching to the left, a gentle rhythm to mimic the natural flows of digestion and heat. He even advised avoiding emotional conversation before bed, lest it troubled the mind's quiet. Roman bathhouses remained open into the evening. The warmth of the water, afterward a light supper, but often sound travelled freely. The city did not sleep easily. Patrons stumbled home from taverns, and yet, amid it all, people found their rest. A practice of quiet introspection. These temples, called Asclepians, were often nestled in the countryside. Slaves, especially household slaves, their beds were sometimes little more than straw in a corner. In larger homes, slave quarters were packed tightly. Pilgrims seeking relief from illness would bathe. Family life was communal and, by necessity, interdependent. While elite Roman children might sleep in adjoining chambers to the pater, the vast majority grew up in modest dwellings, where privacy was a luxury few could afford. If a dream came, especially one involving the god, it was interpreted by priests, trained in decoding these nocturnal messages. Treatments might be prescribed based on the dreams, symbols, baths. It is a sleep, both communal and deeply personal, framed by routine, yet touched always by the unknown. These were not idle inquiries, but the quiet beginnings of Western psychology and medicine. Romans, unlike the dreamers of Egypt or the questioners of Greece, treated sleep with a kind of calculated utility. It was necessary, and so it was structured. A senator returning home, his toga loosened, retreating into the cool atrium of his villa. He lies down, not in the bedroom, but on a low couch in the tablinum. His eyes close as the sound of a small water fountain trickles beside him. This siesta was not indulgent. It was essential. Even soldiers were permitted rest in the peak of the heat, where cicadas have long since quieted, and the stone-paved paths. This meant that in winter, hours were shorter, and in summer, longer. Time bent to the sun. The working day typically began at dawn. By midday, shops would close. Heat pressed down heavily on the city. And so came the meridiatio. This is the world of ancient Greece. A world of questions and contemplation, where even sleep invited speculation. In this society of thinkers, Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, in the Republic, he spoke of sleep as a moment when our rational mind, normally the guiding charioteer, gives way to the unruly horses of desire. In dreams, he claimed, hence the importance of living a disciplined, waking life to guard against chaos in sleep. He proposed that sleep was not a simple shutdown of the senses, but a redirection of bodily energy inward. A process guided by what he called the breath of life that moved through all things. He noted that sleep came most readily after meals, a practical observation familiar to anyone who has dozed after a generous dinner. And yet, he wondered, does the soul itself wander in dreams as the body lies still? His mentor, Plato, had his own musings, but these were thoughts penned by the elite, by those with time for scrolls and shaded porticos. The average Athenian, the city's rhythms were shaped by light. There were no bedside lamps or glowing clocks. Work began at first light, and sleep followed the disappearance of the sun. Homes were modest. Imagine the faint rustle of a linen sheet in the breeze, the gentle clink of a clay oil lamp being snuffed out. Dreams were taken seriously. From this mystical realm of sleep, we glide forward in time to Rome. Of aqueducts. The Roman day was governed by a system of 12 daylight hours, regardless of season. Imagine the forum, usually loud with debate and haggling, now quiet in the high sun. Vendors resting in the shade of their stalls. The Roman elite, much like their Greek counterparts, viewed the night as a time for both sleep and thought. But not all Romans enjoyed such peace. Children, too, shared rooms with siblings and parents. Roman bedrooms, called cubicula, were typically small, private spaces with little adornment. A bed, perhaps. Sleep was both a refuge and a ritual. Roman physicians had their own theories. As you listen, perhaps you feel the pull of this order. A society in which rest was integrated, not resisted. Now, the candles of Rome begin to flicker and fade. A door creaks shut. Somewhere, a stylus is laid to rest beside a half-filled scroll. And so, we end this part of our journey, from the dreams of priests in painted Egyptian halls, the sleep of ordinary lives. Imagine yourself standing at the threshold of an ancient doorway, not a palace entrance or a marble portico, but a simple wooden frame, worn smooth by generations of hands. A humble home, perhaps on the edge of a village in southern Italy, or nestled near a market square in Alexandria, or on the rugged hillside of a small Aegean island. It came in pieces. Houses were designed around an open courtyard, the all, where evening meals were shared and stories were told. The inner rooms, often windowless and cool, provided a quiet refuge for rest. Beds might be made of wooden frames, strung with leather thongs. In summer, one might choose, instead, the flat rooftop, but for sleeping beneath the heavens. This segmented pattern, without clocks or electric light, noted how too much food or too much wine might disturb one's night. Hippocratic texts recommend poppy-based concoctions for farmers who walked fields from dawn to dusk, for blacksmiths whose arms ached from hammering, for shepherds lulled by the soft bleating of their flock. Sleep was not elusive, it was earned, or infusions of herbs like chamomile and hyssop. In the imagined quiet of one of these homes, perhaps it is in Ephesus, where the rhythm of life moved not in seconds or schedules, but in seasons and silences, and in the coming dawn, where a merchant has just set aside his ledgers, or perhaps in Memphis, where a mother has tucked her child into the folds of a woven mat, or in a hut beside the rain, colder, lit not by torches or oil, but by the soft glimmer of candlelight, where a fisherman sleeps with the scent of river reeds in his hair. Bathing before bed was seen as soothing, and in warmer climates, washing away the dust of the day in stone basins under open skies. The stars, for the ancients, were not distant curiosities, but companions. They marked seasons, foretold events, and watched over the slumbering world. To lie beneath them was not simply to seek comfort. It was, in some quiet way, to place oneself in the order of things, shaped by hunger, by tired limbs, and by the slow wheeling of stars overhead. The Sabbath, a sacred day of cessation. The household slept early, rose early, lulled not by lullabies from devices, but by soft stories whispered from memory. Tales of gods and heroes, repeated gestures, a smoothing of the linens, a sip of watered wine, perhaps the telling of a dream from the night before. These rituals, simple though they were, anchored people to their rest. Of animals who spoke, these oral traditions passed through generations like warm blankets, tucking the mind gently into sleep, and moved in rhythms of reflection. This structured peace extended beyond belief. It was practical. It offered space for renewal, for repair. In such practices, we glimpse how ancient societies, even amid hardship, wove gentleness into the pattern of their lives. There was the first sleep, early and often deep, following a long day of labor, and then a waking time, when the fire was stirred again and embers reached. Some used this time for prayer, others for tending to small tasks, nursing an infant, adjusting the loom, preparing for the next day's bread. Within, the day has come to its close. A small clay lamp. The last of the evening bread has been eaten. In spaces that served many purposes, a single room might be a kitchen by morning, a weaving room by afternoon. Furnishings were spare. A few stools, storage jars, a loom, perhaps a simple altar. The scent of ash and olive oil lingers. A mat of straw or reeds, perhaps covered in a worn woolen blanket. A child might curl beside a parent. A grandmother might rest near the fire. The home itself, alive with human breath and quiet dreams. The world outside is hushed. Here, in these modest dwellings of the ancient world, sleep was simple. In Rome, in Athens, in countless towns that have crumbled into dust, ordinary people ended their days in rooms without privacy. Bedding was rolled out only when the work of the day was done. Sleep in this world was not rigid, and then a return to sleep In Greece, the architecture of homes offered subtle insight into their occupants' sleep habits. And those heavens, they were rarely ignored. Among the Hebrews, children's sleep, too, had its rhythms. And though there was no sleep hygiene as we think of it now, there were habits across the ancient world. We also find those who struggled with sleep, just as we do now. Insomnia was known. Perhaps the most powerful sleep aid in the ancient world was not a potion or a philosophy. Let us pause here. Each is different. Each is alike. Each, in their quiet, carried the same truth. That rest is not only a physical need, and so ends our time in the ancient world. As we transition to our next segment, the nature of sleep in the Middle Ages, the marbled cities of Rome have given way to crumbling stone and narrow timber lanes. Olive groves and desert shrines are behind us. The centuries have turned, and with them, we find ourselves in the Middle Ages. Imagine the hush of a village at dusk. The distant peal of a church bell rolls through the misty air like a slow exhale. It was an era ruled by the church. By custom, robed figures shuffle in line, candles in hand, their flames trembling slightly in the draught. The chapel doors creak open. Some orders. Sleep, to them, was necessary but not to be savored. It was given to God, like every other act. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of beeswax. One voice begins to chant. The roosters crow, or perhaps the church bell, marked the day's beginning. Time was not a number, it was a sensation. Cold toes, the smell of baking bread. The return of pale grey light through the slats of a shutter. Urban centres such as London or Paris teemed with noise carts clattering over cobblestones, its presence constant, its bells, its sermons, its warnings. A bed placed near a window might invite evil spirits. One facing north was thought to bring ill luck. Cradles were rocked, not only to calm children, dreams were scrutinized. A pleasant dream might be a message from God. A troubling one, the whisper of the devil. The similarity between the two, stillness, vulnerability, surrender, was not lost on the medieval mind. Understood this truth. And in that surrender, whether in the quiet of a monk's, tombs were carved with effigies of the deceased, lying as if in sleep, hands folded, eyes closed. A peaceful rest, waiting for the trumpet of resurrection. Nightmares were feared, the cries of night watchmen, the howling of dogs. Windows were few and small. The streets were dark, and though curfews were often imposed, grandparents nearby, too little, dangerously unstable, remedies ranged from herbal infusions, valerian, poppy, chamomile, to prayer and penance. Some even tied charms to their bedposts, straw mats, rough linen sheets, if one could afford them. The hush of night falling over a damp thatched roof, all became part of a lullaby, a rhythm passed down with the seasons. In wealthier homes, a wooden bed frame might be raised off the ground, but for the peasantry, if it rained, and often it did, the cold crept in. Yet even so, sleep came. Privacy, rest was communal, and security was found not in solitude, but in proximity. One body warming another, one ear hearing the breath of the next. The Latin syllables rise, then fall again like breath, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Then, as quietly as they came, the monks return to their narrow cells and sleep again. And by an ever-present awareness of death, life was shorter, harder, more fragile in this world. Sleep was not simply a refuge. Families often shared a single room, sleeping side by side on pallets of straw, sometimes with pigs or chickens nearby for warmth. The hearth glowed faintly in the dark, casting flickering light, a time when dreams might bring divine warning. Smoke rises from hearths, curling into the darkening sky. A person might go to bed shortly after dusk, sleep for several hours, then wake in the middle of the night. In this waking period, they might pray, mend clothing, tend to the fire, or simply sit in silence. There was no stigma in being awake at 2 in the morning. It was a common time for quiet thought, whispered conversation, or devotion. Chickens mutter softly in their coops. Dogs stir, then settle. In the stillness, a rhythm emerges. Medieval sleep was shaped profoundly by belief. For most, sleep occurred in 2 distinct phases: a first and second sleep, much like in the ancient world. Benedictine monks in cloisters scattered across Europe. They rose not with the sun but with the bell, often in the deep hours of the night, to chant the divine office, a series of prayers known as the night hours. Matins and lauds were spoken in the cold, dark, voices echoing off stone walls, weaving into silence like thread through cloth. Picture it now, a long corridor of cloistered stone. Monastic sleep was not indulgent. It was minimal, often fragmented, and always subordinate to prayer. Beds were sparse, a thin mattress of straw. But outside the cloister, in small homes of wattle and daub, lit only by firelight or rush lamps, sleep came early and close. There were no alarms. Sleep in these homes was deeply social. Children lay beside their parents. The beds themselves were humble. In some towns, the nighttime was less restful, and always there was the church. There was little medical understanding of sleep. Illness, they believed. Too much sleep could make a person sluggish. The superstitions around the bed were many. Even the very act of sleeping was sometimes seen as a rehearsal for death. And yet, amid the fears and the faith, there was quiet. There was warmth. Sleep was still a comfort. The mother's hand stroking a child's brow, the low rumble of a husband's snore, the rustling of blankets. The medieval world, for all its rigid structures and heavy faith, we gently closed this part of our passage. Beds and bedfellows. The architecture and rituals of medieval sleep. Let us now pass quietly through the oak doors and woolen curtains of medieval homes, not only of monks or peasants, but of nobles and kings, of merchants and midwives. For in the rooms where people lay down their heads, shadows stretch long over uneven walls, a tapestry rustles slightly in a breeze. There is quiet, not absolute silence, but a living hush, filled with small sounds. Travelers might share a bed at an inn with strangers. The lord of a manor might sleep on a bed so large it was called a great bed, surrounded by tapestries and velvet. In places like Westminster or the Château de Vincennes, nobles might be invited to watch the king retire for the night. Not the act of sleep itself, but the ritual of being undressed, offered warm wine. Meanwhile, servants would lie in the hallway just outside, ready to be summoned with a single call. These might be verses from the Bible, written on scraps of parchment and tucked beneath the pillow. A tipped candle. Many towns instituted laws requiring lights to be extinguished by a certain hour. The curfew, from the old French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. When the church bell rang out, its heavy, echoing tone, and sleep, or a crucifix hung from the bedpost. In a world of toil, prayer, and unpredictability, it offered a reprieve, a rhythm. The scent of melted wax lingers beyond the bed frame, a return. Dogs barked. The world did not fall silent, but rather changed tone. Even herbs, rosemary, rue, or vervain, might be laid beside the bed to ward off bad spirits or induce calm dreams. And for those who could not sleep, medieval medicine viewed the body as a balance of humours. If one could not sleep, perhaps the black bile was too strong, or the blood too hot. Physicians might prescribe diet changes, herbal teas, readings from scripture, or simply waiting out the restlessness. In some cases, sleep was delayed intentionally. Monks, as we've said, woke for prayers, but others, like scribes and writers, believing that inspiration visited in the quiet hours, their sleep was interrupted. Washing before bed. In wealthier homes, a basin of water would be brought to the bedside, sometimes perfumed with rose or mint. In simpler settings, cleanliness before sleep was not just for comfort. It was seen as morally virtuous. Servants often slept at the foot of their master's bed, and in noble households, it was common for a lady-in-waiting to sleep in the same room, or even the same bed. It was a stage for power. Marriages were consummated here, heirs were conceived, and the linens themselves were often embroidered with symbols of lineage or faith. This was not unusual or suspect. It was simply practical. Beds were limited, and in the cold dark of the medieval night, a log shifting in the hearth, the soft, rhythmic creak of the bed's ropes. As one settles in, we glimpse not just their fatigue, but their values, their fears. For the devout, sleep was a vulnerable time. The soul, it was believed, could wander in dreams, and might be tempted by devils or touched by angels. A whispered pater noster, and the delicate rituals that shaped the end of their day. Close your eyes and imagine a medieval bedroom. No polished nightstand or electric light, and frequently raised high from the ground to avoid drafts. To climb into them, one might need a small stool. A mattress, often just a sack of straw or feathers, was laid on the floor or atop a wooden frame. Blankets were few, shared among family members. Children might sleep beside siblings or curled at their mother's side, swaddled in thick linen. Heat was precious, and body warmth was a resource to be used, not denied. Instead, you might find a chest at the foot of a bed, filled with linens and winter wool. The floor might be bare stone or sweet flag. Candles flicker in the corners, their wax dripping slowly. Medieval beds were often the most valuable pieces of furniture in a home, especially for the well-to-do. Constructed of oak or walnut, sometimes intricately carved curtains surrounded the bed on all four sides. Not just for warmth, but for privacy. This bed within a bed allowed a person to close themselves off from the rest of the room. In some cases, the bedchamber itself was public. Servants came and went. Business might be conducted there, or food delivered. Only behind the curtains did true privacy begin. In poorer homes, of course, co-sleeping was the norm across all classes. Sleeping arrangements also reflected social order. For kings and queens, the bedroom was part stage. The royal bed was not merely furniture. Yet despite these distinctions, in some traditions, bed charms were used, and yet the night was not always peaceful. Fire was a constant worry. Night watchmen patrolled the streets, calling out the hours. Insomnia existed, of course, for the chronically unwell. But despite these complexities, sleep was at its heart a constant. And so, in these chambers, humble or grand, a familiar ritual played out night after night. The tucking in of blankets. As we prepare to leave the medieval world behind, the landscape of dreams, visions, warnings, and wanderings of the medieval mind, let your mind now drift from the tangible, the straw-filled mattresses, the wooden beds. We leave behind the physical chamber and enter the quiet inner sanctum of the medieval sleeper, the realm of imagination. For the medieval mind, it was a message, a mirror, sometimes a warning. Sleeping in a small cottage near the edge of a forest, a vivid dream was not always shared openly. Some monks, especially in the Benedictine, one popular account from the 13th century, describes a monk dreaming of being weighed on a great balance scale, his sins dragging him downward until a beam of light, interpreted as divine mercy, lifted him just enough to be spared. Such stories served both as caution and comfort, or of unconfessed sin. Kings and nobles sometimes made decisions based on dreams, whether to go to war, whom to trust, or which lands to claim. These dreams, of course, were interpreted by trusted advisors and priests, and not always to the benefit of truth. It is easy. Remedies included confession, fasting, or even exorcism in extreme cases. Among the most touching accounts of medieval dreams are those of everyday people, often recorded in court documents, letters. One tells of a mother dreaming of her son. Another recounts a carpenter who dreamed of a red bird singing at his window before the death of his wife. These were not political dreams. They were human ones, filled with longing. People might turn to herbal cures or folk prayers passed down in oral tradition. In illuminated manuscripts, their thought rendered as a cloud above their head, within which an angel, a demon, or a fantastical creature appears. The mind, loosed from the day's tasks, wandered freely through landscapes of symbol and shadow. These illustrations were both symbolic and instructional, reminding the viewer that sleep was not merely rest, but exposure to grace or temptation. A simple phrase, "In God's name, I sleep and rise," was whispered by many before bed, a shield against the unknown, There was no firm division between body and soul, between reality and the otherworldly. Dreams blurred these lines further. Imagine once more the quiet sea, one candle flickering at the bedside, the sleeper breathing slowly beneath a woolen blanket, the stars outside hidden by thick cloud. Inside the mind, a vision forms of a forest path, or a radiant figure, or perhaps something nameless. And the journey begins. They were treated with reverence, suspicion, and awe, wrote about dreams in their spiritual diaries. These accounts were often stark, metaphorical, and deeply personal. A monk might dream of a burning stairway, which he interpreted as a sign to seek humility. Nor you. Another might dream of a feast while fasting, and confess it the next morning as a temptation of the flesh. To admit to certain visions, particularly if they were sensual, violent, or heretical, could be dangerous. The line between divine vision and dangerous imagination was thin. Saints were said to receive dreams from angels. Heretics, it was whispered. The day behind her has been long gathering herbs. Dreams were discussed with careful attention. People sought patterns and meanings. Charms were created to invite good dreams or repel nightmares. Small satchels of lavender or valerian might be hung over the bed. In some regions, people placed iron implements beneath the bed to ward off spirit. Others recited protective verses from the Psalms before sleep, turning to clergy or local wise women for interpretation. The word nightmare itself comes from the Old English mare, a kind of evil spirit believed to sit on the chest of a sleeper, suffocating them and bringing dreadful visions. Today, we might call this sleep paralysis. A moment where the body cannot move, and hallucinations sometimes occur. But in the medieval world, this was not medical. It was spiritual. The Vanara Critica, a book on dream interpretation written centuries earlier by the Greek, continued to be studied and adapted well into the Middle Ages. Its pages were filled with symbolic language. To dream of fire meant passion or destruction. To see teeth fall out, the death of a loved one. To fly, perhaps a sign of the soul yearning for freedom. Tending goats, she has fallen asleep near the hearth. Her head resting on a bundle of folded cloth. The fire has died to glowing coals. The wind presses against the shutters. She begins to dream. In an age without modern science or psychology, they were catalogued, dissected, prayed over, and feared. Let us imagine now a peasant woman in the 12th century. The church offered its own lens. Dreams, it taught, could be holy, like those of Joseph, warned in sleep to flee with Mary and the infant Christ, or they could be temptations, snares laid by the devil. A dream might be sent by God or by demons. Discerning the source was part of the spiritual work of being a good Christian. Perhaps she sees a river rising swiftly, sweeping her away, or a white stag pausing on the hilltop. She wakes before dawn, or only the residue of the day. Such questions did not fade with waking. Dreams lingered. In towns and courts, monasteries and marketplaces. But these interpretations were not universal, and so people were cautious. In these writings, dreams often reflected the ongoing struggle between the sacred and the sinful. Beyond monasteries, the laity engaged with dreams in their own ways. Nightmares were especially feared. To suffer repeated nightmares could be seen as a sign of demonic oppression, but not all dreamers were kings or clergy. Medieval art, too, captured dreams. It is worth remembering that most people in the Middle Ages lived in a world where waking life and spiritual mystery were deeply entangled. And so, as night returned, as candles were extinguished and shutters drawn, sleepers surrendered not just to fatigue, but to whatever visions might come. As we gently close this chapter of medieval dreaming, medicine, mind, and the slowly waking world, we now find ourselves in the fading centuries of the medieval era, an age still shaped by faith, yet increasingly touched by curiosity, by the faint glimmer of reason returning to the shores of human understanding. Let us move slowly through this final part of the medieval night. The candle is still burning low. It borrowed heavily from earlier sources, especially Greek and Roman texts, yet it carried its own unique blend of observation, ritual, and speculative philosophy. The world remains cloaked in dark, but somewhere beyond the silence of a world gently beginning to stir from centuries of slumber, poring over vellum manuscripts, scribbling notes on the dreams of a patient, observing the color of their skin, began to care for the sleep of their patients. Fresh straw, herbs for calming, and quiet chambers were prescribed. Some nuns, particularly those in the Hôtel of Paris, became known for their gentle treatment of the sick and restless, offering warm milk, soft prayers. In larger towns, homes with multiple rooms became more common among the merchant class. The idea of a separate bedroom, a space, not just for sleeping but for quiet, not yet widespread, not yet standard, a hint of what would come in later centuries, and the comfort of human presence. Towns grew larger, and so the night continued to unfold as it always had, slowly, deeply, rhythmically. And though the curfew bells still rang, people sought meaning, comfort, and a sense of order in a world so often uncertain. Certain trades, bakers, guards, millers, worked into the night. In some cities, small lanterns were hung above doorways or along main roads, offering a faint, golden glow. Night was no longer solely the domain of silence and prayer. It was beginning gently, the state of their urine. This was medicine, as it was then practiced. Folk remedies for sleeplessness were shared from grandmother to granddaughter, often blending observation with superstition. A sprig of rosemary under the pillow, a warm stone placed by the feet, a short walk before bed. These rituals, simple and tender, spoke to a universal truth: the search for comfort, filled with fearful visions, excess blood. Students studied Galen and Hippocrates alongside newer thinkers. They discussed sleep, not as a spiritual phenomenon. A recurring nightmare might prompt both confession and a change in diet. Physicians and clerics often worked side by side, one tending the body, the other the soul. Sleep, like so much else in the medieval mind, was a space where science and belief cohabited, not in conflict, but in quiet coexistence. There were debates about whether the heart or the brain governed sleep, whether the soul truly left the body during dreams. Wine, phlegm could produce drowsiness and apathy. A harmonious balance, therefore, was essential, not just for waking life, but for peaceful, restorative rest. The line between the medical and the mystical remained thin. As beliefs about dreams and sleep continued to influence spiritual life, another force quietly emerged beside them. The medieval understanding of sleep, while limited by the tools of its time, was more complex than one might expect. Nor you. Central to medical thought was the theory of the four humours. You may recall them from earlier: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These fluids, it was believed, governed all aspects of physical and mental health. Sleep. Too much black bile associated with melancholy could cause disturbed sleep. The medieval physician's guidebook, Regimen Sanatatasa, a widely circulated health manual compiled in Salerno during the 12th century, offered practical advice. Sleep, it claimed, was best taken in moderation. Too much, too little. One should not sleep immediately after eating. One should sleep on the right side first, then turn to the left, and most importantly, one should rise early, in tune with the light. Imagine a learned physician in a quiet chamber, yet not all medical thought was wholly grounded in ancient theory. In cities like Bologna, hospitals, though rudimentary by modern standards, and yet, for all this developing science, a sleepless patient might be treated with herbs one night. In homes, advice trickled down from these texts into tradition. Even the architecture of sleep began to shift slightly. Night itself was changing, too. Still, for most, sleep remained deeply tied to the rising and setting of the sun. Darkness was respected, and the dreams continued, some filled with saints, others with monsters, some forgotten by morning. In these dreams, and in the body's quiet rest, shifting shadows, how sleep changed with the age of reason. The bells of medieval towers no longer toll overhead. The chants have quieted. A new light begins to flicker across Europe. This is the world of the Renaissance, and, after it, here, the past and the present stand shoulder to shoulder, then a second sleep. But the presence of artificial light nudges the pattern. In London, a physician drafts a letter after his family sleeps. In Leiden, the world is stretching its waking hours. Still no strict boundaries as today. A chamber might still host visitors. Thinkers like Robert Burton, writing in The Anatomy of Melancholy in 1621, describe sleep as essential to the mind's balance. Too much, he warns, and the mind dulls. Too little, and the spirit suffers. He catalogues types of insomnia and methods to treat it: warm drinks, moderate exercise, gentle distraction. He speaks of the dreamer with care, not ridicule. But there is growing understanding that sleep is personal, even sacred in its own quiet way. Beds grow in size and softness. Feather mattresses replace straw. Candles placed in carved sconces. Nightclothes are tailored. Is it the brain cooling itself? As some propose, is it a turning inward or a shutting down? There are no firm answers. Servants help undress the master or mistress. Diarists from the period begin to include notes on dreams, on restlessness, on the peculiar habits of their own nights. There is growing awareness that sleep differs from person to person, a shift away from the belief in a single correct pattern. Silver bowls of warm water await at the foot of the bed. The act of going to bed has become, in some corners of society, a production, calm, deliberate, mildly theatrical. Curtains are lined. Taverns spill laughter into the alleys. Watchmen shout warnings or prayers. The city night becomes a patchwork of light and sound, of sleep and stirring. In colder climates, coals, warm basins at the bedside. The more the mind is examined, the more its vulnerability is feared. The sleeper, madness, melancholy, hysteria, all linked, in part, to sleep. Doctors advise regular hours, avoiding too much excitement before bed, limiting rich food. Sleep, once a shared surrender, becomes slightly more managed, controlled. Domestic routines adjust. The flickering of a candle becomes part of the sleep environment, but increasingly they are approached with skepticism or curiosity rather than fear. The soul, some suggest, is not leaving the body. It is speaking from within, a mirror, not a message. And for the first time, or to read, to write, to think, sleep becomes part of daily accounting, not only a spiritual interval, but a physical one. Ancient texts are no longer mysterious relics, but subjects of admiration and translation. With clocks in churches, urban households, especially those of artisans or merchants, are small and densely populated. The smell of wax, sweat, and the ashes of a fire form the olfactory backdrop of sleep. Mattresses turned with the change of season, yet sleep still comes, honest, if unremarkable. People begin measuring sleep by hour rather than by light. Midnight is no longer a vague concept. The chiming of bells or ticking of gears accompanies the sleeper, or interrupts him. The printing press hums like a distant heartbeat in the background. Candles, though costly, are more widely used. Lanterns flicker down stone alleys. Time itself begins to tighten its grip. Hours are measured with greater precision. The clock, and with it, the night shifts in character. Art blossoms not only as devotion, but as expression. Medicine begins to probe with cautious hands. The telescope points outward. And in this world, sleep, though still cloaked in mystery, begins to change. Cities are growing. Many still rise with the dawn. Waking at midnight is still common, often used for reflection. A household might sleep and stir at different intervals. Beds are still shared, curtains still drawn, people still sleep in stages. A first sleep, a waking hour. In Florence, a painter sets down his brush by lamplight, his mind still full of colour. Yet even as patterns shift, in noble homes, among the learned sleep becomes a subject of modest interest. Dream interpretation continues, but the focus shifts subtly. Dreams are still seen as potentially meaningful. This is an era of cautious steps between belief and observation. Diaries mention wakeful nights or long, heavy mornings. Timepieces change the texture of rest among the working class. Some noblemen have nightcaps. Bedchambers are decorated with embroidered hangings. Yet not all is comfort. As cities grow denser, coaches rumble through streets. The Enlightenment brings greater scrutiny to everything, including the body, the brain, and the rhythms of sleep. Scholars debate whether sleep is mechanical or spiritual. In private, individuals reflect more on their own sleep. This period also brings new anxieties. Yet even in this age of calculation, sleep retains its mystery. The candle still burns low beside the bed. The world still falls quiet. Sleep remains, as it has always been, both ordinary and profound. Sleep in the lives of the enlightened thinkers, artists. The oil lamps gutter low in their sconces. Quills are set down beside half-written letters, and the polished wood of a writing desk glows faintly in the candlelight. Across Europe and reform have found their silence, at least for the night. This is the world not of theory, but of the personal. The private moments of sleep in the lives of the thinkers, artists. His famous dictum, but social in philosophy. In letters and essays, he promoted temperance and moderation, believing that irregular hours, late night, indulgence, or luxurious bedding led not only to physical discomfort, but to moral laxity. Sleep, in his view, was like a tool, essential, but to be used efficiently. It was a personal creed, known for his insomnia and erratic habits. Voltaire often wrote through the night. Coffee, strong and plentiful, fueled his evenings. His correspondence is full of musings, sent in the small hours. Kant awoke each day, at the same time, took the same walk. Sleep was part of the rational maintenance of the self. Nor you, it is said, the residence of Kant on his daily constitutional, his mind weaving through harmonies that lulled others to rest. His home was filled with the sounds of music, of paper turning, of a quill scratching rhythmically against the stave. He slept in short intervals. His sleep habits were emblematic of his philosophy. His letters describe sleep interrupted by melodies. He would wake, scribble them down in the dark, then return to bed. In these cases, sleep was not an escape, but a companion, a space where inspiration emerged. It is lived, examined, structured, disrupted, it begins to take on the qualities we still recognize. The preference for regularity, the desire for control, the tension between night's stillness and the mind's wandering. In his reveries of a solitary walker, he described lying beneath trees, listening to the wind. They designed their nights, and in doing so, they left behind clues, faint and flickering, about how rest had evolved. A brief, deep sleep before another dawn. Their nights were quieter in record, but not in value, drifting into a doze as part of a deeper connection with nature. For Rousseau, sleep was restorative not only of the body, but of the soul, a return to simplicity, a soft escape from the artificial demands of society. He slept late into the morning, sometimes into the afternoon, seeks harmony and sleep, spontaneous, unforced, is a reflection of that desire, and saw no shame in irregularity. He suffered from depression, now thought to be clinical, and his nights were restless. He walked the streets of London in the early hours. He wrote of lying in bed. Thoughts. He awoke at 5. Sleep came when the mind was quiet, and the mind, in his case, rarely was. His days were segmented with such care that sleep became an act of moral discipline, that Leonardo adhered to a polyphasic sleep pattern. Short naps, spaced throughout the day and night, never fully surrendering to long slumber. He may have slept for only 20 minutes at a time, every 4 hours, the Uberman cycle, as modern enthusiasts call it, and in his waking life, he spoke often of the night time as a place of temptation and introspection. In their rest, waking to sketch, to experiment, to tinker with mechanical forms and anatomical diagrams. His journals are full of sudden insights, fragments of dreams and nocturnal musings. In these notes, we see not only the breadth of his mind, but its refusal to truly rest. Consider Leonardo da Vinci. It is said, though debated, if true, this would have meant Leonardo passed each night in brief, dozing intervals. Though few followed Leonardo's path, the age of efficiency was stirring, not in the industrial sense, not yet, but in the personal. How one ordered one's hours was seen as a mark of discipline, and with that, sleep became more than rest. It became a window into a person's habits, morals, and mind. Benjamin Franklin, ever practical and meticulous. Franklin's sleep was solitary in structure. In France, the philosopher Voltaire took a more unstructured approach. Voltaire's attitude was less about balance, more about necessity. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, by contrast, wrote of sleep with great tenderness. He often napped during his long walks, reclining on grassy banks or shaded stone walls. Across the Channel, Johnson's sleep, or lack thereof, was not simply biological. It reflected his internal turbulence. Then there was Immanuel Kant. Ben Tao Kant. Rigid, punctual, devoted to order. Kant believed the mind required proper rest to perform reasoned thought. Dreams were acknowledged, but not indulged. Artists who had their rituals, Johann Sebastian Bach, for instance, composed into the evening hours, often by candlelight, often stayed awake, composing into the night. Among the less visible figures of the time, and seamstresses. In these centuries, it is not yet medical in the modern sense, nor purely spiritual. Each of these figures, from Franklin-esque discipline to Rousseau-esque daydreams, shaped their sleep around their beliefs. Sleep troubles, sleep cures, illness, imbalance, and nighttime in the age of inquiry. Now the air grows still again, in drawing rooms in modest cottages, across cobbled cities and quiet villages. The hush of night returns, and with it, not always peace. For the sleepless, the night was not a bomb, but a long corridor of silence. A merchant's wife, tossing beneath heavy blankets, a scholar lying rigid in his study, a soldier far from battle, but still reliving it, Night terrors, what some described as crushing dreams, were widely reported. A sensation of weight on the chest, of being held down or watched. We now understand this as sleep paralysis, sprinkled salt across thresholds, or hung protective charms near the headboard. Others slept with a knife beneath their pillow, not for defense in the modern sense, but as a talisman against the unseen. Then it was interpreted through the lens of folklore, known sometimes as noctambulation. It was observed with a mix of fascination and alarm. In households where this occurred, those who walked in their sleep were not awakened. A belief prevailed that sudden waking might cause shock or death. Women in childbirth experienced hallucinations brought on by exhaustion. Overcrowded lodgings, thin blankets, and constant labor left little time for rest. Some worked through the night. Bakers, night watchmen, prostitutes, their sleep coming in stolen pieces during the day. This was not called a disorder. The Enlightenment offered light. Some lay with windows open, others drew the curtains tightly. But not all shadows can be banished. It was simply, others viewed them as ill, melancholic, in need of rest cures. The spectrum of interpretation remained wide, a sign of the era's transition from medieval belief to modern science. The mentally ill, many untreated and misunderstood, wandered the streets at night, their cries echoing into the dark. Whether restless or sound, the night was a mirror to the soul's condition. For some, sleep was a place of retreat. For others, it was a territory of ghosts. Instead, to rise in the middle of the night, the bedroom might be warmer, but the mind, in the age of candlelight and growing curiosity, the hours of sleep were not uniformly gentle. Wrote of sleep as a function of the brain. He noted differences between deep and light sleep. He speculated that dreaming might be linked to imagination. His ideas were not yet modern. In Scandinavia, it was the Mara, the source of the word nightmare, an entity who rode the sleeper and whispered dread, a malfunction of the nerves, or a clue to the workings of the mind. In England, the night, though softened by the Enlightenment's reason, still held its share of uncertainty. The sleep disorders we now recognize, insomnia, sleepwalking, nightmares, were present, though not yet clearly named. People of the 17th and 18th centuries experienced disturbed sleep in myriad forms. Too much heat in the blood, a troubled mind, a guilty conscience, an overactive imagination. Physicians prescribed herbal teas, warm milk, or light supper, baths infused with calming plants, a small dose of laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, might be recommended for the particularly restless. It dulled the mind and weighted the eyelids, but it was a dangerous friend, addictive and easy to misuse, often attributing it to causes that blended physical, emotional, and spiritual origins. Sleep, for many, remained a time of struggle, disrupted by dreams, haunted by restlessness, and shadowed by maladies the waking world could not always explain. As understanding of the human body deepened in this era, so too did awareness of its fragility, or even a long philosophical tract. Others encouraged recitation of prayers, repetitive and calming. Still others advised a change of bed linens, a reordering of the room, or a relocation of the bed to a different corner, away from drafts, or, less tangibly, from bad spirits. Let us begin with insomnia, sleeplessness, known by many names, none comforting. It was understood, in the language of the time, as a disturbance of the humours. Some recommended reading aloud before sleep. The struggle was not to fall asleep, but to stay there. In German-speaking regions, to prevent such visits. Another common affliction of the night was somnambulism, sleepwalking. Some believed the soul had not fully returned to the body. Others feared possession or madness. Writers, physicians, and philosophers recorded these episodes in letters and diaries. They puzzled over their meaning. Were such acts an extension of the dream world? We see these questions reflected in early scientific observations. Thomas Willis, a 17th century English physician and anatomist. Still, even science did not erase mystery. Fevers caused vivid dreams. Among the poor, sleep was often fragmented. In wealthier homes, there was more control, but not always more comfort. In a time where the body was increasingly measured, poked, and charted, the mysteries of sleep still resisted full capture. People continued to rely on their rituals. The night was a space of both control and surrender. Those who could not sleep were sometimes seen as more sensitive. What had not changed was the deeply personal nature of sleep. Ticking into the night, clocks, timekeeping, and the industrialization of sleep, the room is still. A single candle remains, burning steadily, but now near the hearth, or mounted on a nearby shelf, shaping the rhythm of daily life. And quietly, subtly, something new has entered the sleeping chamber. Time began to transform from a broad, seasonal rhythm to a fixed, measurable force, and with it, not a sundial outside or a bell in the chapel. A clock, ticking, counting, a mechanical whisper that brings time into the room. The bed is shared by two brothers, one finishing a late shift, the other rising soon for an early one. Not as a medical ideal, but as a logistical necessity. Employers wanted punctuality. Schools began earlier. The standard night's rest started to form, not from nature, but from need. The sheets are damp from breath and sweat. A single window lets in. Watches were wound each night before sleep. Timepieces became symbols of order. The streets outside, never truly quiet. Now, advice centered on consistency. Go to bed at 10, rise at 6, maintain the rhythm. This echoed both industrial needs and growing Enlightenment ideals. That the rational individual should govern the body, like a well-run household. Placed on bedside tables, the line between cure and poison remained thin, but people, now pressed by time, families began enforcing bedtime as a form of moral upbringing. The upper classes could afford to rest. Physicians noted an increase in fatigue, nervousness, disturbed sleep. They coined new terms, neurasthenia, nervous exhaustion. These were not always linked to sleep explicitly, but the connection was there. Retiring earlier, they employed staff to accommodate their preferred rhythms. For most people, the night became a time of quiet conformity. Go to bed. Rise early to breathe slowly. The Romantics romanticized them, seeing dreams as poetic, symbolic, even prophetic. Coleridge famously claimed that his poem Kubla Khan came to him in a dream. Writers explored them. Sleepwalking and nighttime visions became motifs. Meanwhile, the working poor adjusted their bodies to the needs of the clock, often at the expense of their health. To rise early, to sleep soundly, was a sign of virtue and discipline. To oversleep or resist the bedtime hour suggested laziness or willfulness. Bedrooms were designed with greater attention to silence and privacy. Sleep was delayed. Cool air, light, evening meals, and regular hours. Heavy drapes, soft colors, books, instead of conversation before bed. No spirits, or perhaps just a small glass of port. For the anxious, gentle walks at dusk were prescribed. For the depressed, these were not cures, but habits, ways to coax the body into rest. In city neighborhoods, social events moved into the evening hours, and so the sleep of many began to shrink, not in quality, always, but in length. In wealthier homes, the master and mistress had separate sleeping chambers, a shift not only of intimacy, but of routine. Servants were instructed to maintain quiet. Windows were fitted with heavier drapes to block early light. The home, once lit and lively, with hearth and chatter well into the night, grew quieter, more controlled. Footsteps, the occasional call of a newspaper boy at dawn, the bell of the parish, or the silence of the dark. Their rest was governed by natural cues, with variations by season and trade, no longer rising with the light. Laborers now followed the shift bell, often at early hours, compressed window between long shifts, 10 and 12-hour days. In textile mills and coal mines, laborers worked deep into the night, or rose in the freezing dark to begin again. Children, too, were employed. Entire families shared beds, or rotated them, one sleeping while another worked. This wasn't called insomnia. It was survival, sometimes long before sunrise. To miss the morning call was to lose a day's pay, or worse. Time was no longer ambient, it was disciplinary, but the steady hum of machines and the demands of factory schedules changed that, as the Enlightenment gave way to the Industrial Revolution, and Europe edged into the 18th and early 19th centuries. In pre-industrial times, people had followed the movement of the sun. As factories replaced fields and workers migrated from countryside to city, time began to tighten its grip. Sleep began to shrink. For the working poor, sleep became a precious. Imagine now a narrow room above a London workshop. The idea of sleep as a continuous, uninterrupted 8 hours in the middle and upper classes. The ticking clock became a fixture in parlors. Pocket watches were carried. Doctors, too, began recommending fixed hours for sleep, gone with the flexible patterns of segmented rest. Even architecture adapted, with gas lighting, evenings stretched later. The very concept of a bedtime became a formal household rule, especially for children. Nor you. Alongside this new structure came the spread of sleep aids, both mechanical and medicinal. Some households kept small sand timers to track how long candles burned, a quiet way of measuring time before bed. Others used window alarms. For those who couldn't sleep, the market offered new remedies. Soothing syrups containing opiates were sold in pharmacies. Herbal tinctures were bottled and labeled. There were social changes too. With time more controlled, sleep became more regulated by class. Medical literature of the late 18th and early 19th centuries began to comment on these divisions. In this period, we also see the earliest inklings of what we now call sleep hygiene. Writers and physicians advised dark rooms. At the same time, the belief in dreams shifted. Dreams, but these were artistic exceptions. The night's mystery was fading. Still, beneath all these changes, the working people continued to seek what they always had: a place to lie down. The modern age and the psychology of sleep. The clock ticks still, but now something new happens. At the turn of a small switch, the dark is banished completely. What was once a sacred pause, a nightly ritual, or a temporary death of the senses becomes. The gas lamps have recently been replaced by small electric bulbs, powered by a humming grid beyond the walls. Eyes tire, muscles ache. But sleep no longer arrives unchallenged. It must now wait its turn, even after the sun has long vanished. The kitchen glows with pale light. The parlor is still lively. The workday, whether embraced or rejected, they give shape to a new view of sleep, that the night is not a cessation but a transformation. Carl Jung proposes that dreams reflect not only individual unconsciousness, but archetypes, universal figures and themes embedded deep within all human minds. The wise old man, the child. Sleep becomes not only a rest, but a mythic journey. Each night, we cross a border into a landscape crafted by memory, emotion, and culture, a space where the mind continues its work silently. At last, the warm flicker of a candle gives way to a steady, unblinking electric light. Others are building a science of sleep rooted in the body. Electroencephalograms, EEGs, allow doctors to monitor brain waves. Books are written on how to sleep better, when to sleep, how to fall asleep faster. Some suggest warm baths. Others recommend counting, meditation, or light reading. For the troubled sleeper, for the first time, researchers can peer into the sleeping mind without waking it. What they find astonishes them. Others warn that oversleeping dulls the mind. In both cases, sleep is evaluated, not for its own sake, but their effects are mixed, and so the cycle begins. Wakefulness, medication, drowsiness, dependence. Dream dictionaries become popular. People pay to have their dreams interpreted. Magazines publish dream advice columns. The dream, once a sacred or hidden thing, becomes part of pop culture. Simplified, categorized, and packaged, the brain still dreams. The breath slows. The eyes flutter beneath closed lids. The rhythms of our ancestors remain. Factory employees, nurses, miners, all find their sleep fractured, out of sync with the sun. Sleep clinics begin to treat these cases as medical conditions. The concept of circadian rhythm, rooms once defined by nightfall. In Franz Kafka's stories, it becomes elusive, surreal, fragmented. In Virginia Woolf's writing, it is fluid, blending memory and time. The modernist era brings sleep into question. The brain, far from shutting down, follows a complex pattern. Like a tide, ebbing and flowing through the night. The bed, often the most significant piece of furniture, is chosen with care. Bedspreads are matched to wallpaper, pillows are fluffed and placed just so. Parents rise multiple times a night. Travelers cross time zones, their bodies confused by artificial clocks. Sleep, once governed by sky and candle, is now shaped by alarm clocks, medications, and schedules. Children are tucked in with storybooks and lullabies. These discoveries lay the groundwork for sleep medicine. Trains run on strict timetables, separate rooms for parents and children, curtains to block out light. Springs and mattresses replace straw and rope. Bedtime routines emerge. The industrial clock governs factories, schools, and homes alike. The idea of the 8-hour night becomes not just a recommendation, but a social standard. Sleep hygiene emerges: a quiet room, a comfortable bed, consistent hours, and so the night is changed. Why do we dream? What is the mind doing while we sleep? What happens when sleep goes wrong? These are not questions for priests or folk healers now, or monks in communal halls. Sleep becomes something you do alone, behind a closed door, in the silence of your own room. Privacy? They are the domain of a new profession. As the 19th century presses forward, his name is Sigmund Freud, and his theory, still forming, is that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. Start in a modest home, perhaps in a city like New York or Berlin, around the 1880s, offers a radical view that our nightly visions are not divine messages or meaningless flickers, but expressions of buried desire. Every symbol, a stairway, a locked door, a falling tooth, holds a meaning, often hidden behind layers of censorship and disguise. The mind, he argues, it shifts into another mode. Speaking in metaphor, the body, however, does not forget its older rhythms. This change, the conquest of night, where people once followed the sun, now they follow the filament. Families eat later, work continues into the evening, yet the need for sleep remains, and so questions begin to surface, deeper questions than before. In Vienna, a doctor sits in his study, scribbling notes beside a patient's couch. Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1899, Freud's ideas catch fire, others follow. Yet, while Freud and Jung wander through dreams, sleep, it turns out, is not a flat plane, but a series of cycles, REM and non-REM phases, deep sleep and dreaming sleep. But outside the lab, everyday life is shifting rapidly. Cities swell. In homes, bedrooms become personal sanctuaries. This is the era when sleep becomes private, no longer shared as before, between travelers in inns, families on straw mats, and yet new anxieties arise. Insomnia becomes a subject of medical concern. Pharmaceuticals enter the picture. Barbiturates. Their promise is simple: quick, dreamless sleep. Meanwhile, dreams are commercialized. In the workplace, sleep becomes a kind of resource. Productivity experts advise against. Some promote naps to 20-minute breaks to restore alertness. Shift work complicates matters. In literature, sleep takes on new tones. At the same time, the home remains centered on sleep. For many, these rituals are comforting. Depression and anxiety affect sleep. War veterans return with fractured rest. And yet, through all these changes, the body continues its quiet cycles. Sleep habits of the 20th century's notable minds. The 20th century unfolds with speed. Telephones, radios, typewriters, cars, airplanes. A world once quiet after sundown now thrums through the night, and within it, individuals emerge who shape the course of politics, science, art, and war. A man known for cigars, but also for his dedicated napping. These figures lived in a century of acceleration, yet many of them, curiously, had strikingly personal relationships with sleep. Each rested, or refused to rest, in their own way. Let's begin with Winston Churchill. He understood that the mind needed intervals of rest, even in times of crisis. Churchill famously practiced what he called a non-negotiable afternoon rest. Even during the height of World War II, he made time, often in the late afternoon, for a nap of roughly an hour and a half. It's said he solved complex equations in his head without writing them down during these nocturnal wanderings. His rest, such as it was, came not in long sleeps, he claimed, whether through truth or bravado, that he required only 2 hours of sleep each night. Some nights he claimed not to sleep at all. He also napped during the day, sometimes while holding a spoon between his fingers. When it slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor, instead, he dozed in a chair with a cloth. And some believe he used them deliberately to catch ideas as they surfaced in the liminal space of half-sleep. His rest was not hurried or minimized. The sleep patterns of the 20th century's minds were as varied as their work. His insomnia was legendary. He often stayed awake into the early hours, pacing, writing letters, working. He described the night as a time of mental hyperactivity. The silence sharpened his thoughts. Her sleep habits, while not documented in extreme detail, reflected the calm discipline with which she approached both science and life. After the long, exhausting hours of research, especially in the early years of isolating radium, her rest was one who rose at dawn and retired early, regardless of circumstances. A time when sleep began to be studied, but was still deeply personal. No single rhythm fit all. Each person shaped their nights according to need, belief, temperament, and circumstance. His discipline, military bearing, and insistence on order extended to his sleep. He believed in restoring the mind each night, so that decisions could be made with clarity at first light. He embraced it as part of his creativity. His restlessness colored his work, stories filled with anxiety, transformation, and fragmented realities. In his case, sleep wasn't restorative. It was elusive. And in that elusiveness, he could often be found sleeping on a workbench, coat rolled beneath his head. For him, despite the weight of leadership, he understood the importance of conserving energy. After lunch, he would lie down for a short sleep. Even as president, his aides were instructed not to disturb him. Her tight schedule, her towering mental focus, and her political ferocity were maintained, she said, through brief and efficient rest. Whether this claim was strictly true is debated. Some of her aides later suggested she napped more than she admitted. These naps were not long. They gave him clarity and calm in the high-pressure world of Cold War politics. And during his illnesses, including polio-related fatigue, sleep became not just helpful, but essential. He considered it a waste of time, a regrettable biological necessity. Would sit in a chair with a heavy key in his hand, above a plate on the floor. As he began to doze, the key would slip, strike the plate, and wake him. In that brief threshold between sleep and wakefulness, he claimed to access the purest ideas for his paintings. Though this may have been part of his public persona, he believed this fragile state. He once said, "Sleep is a criminal waste of time, inherited from our cave days." Draw the heavy curtains of his wartime residence. Afterward, he would dress again as if beginning a second day, refreshed, alert, and often more tactically sharp. His aides knew not to interrupt this sacred interval. He worked late into the night, often dictating from bed or while walking in slippers through the halls of 10 Downing Street. This was not laziness in his eyes, but necessity. He claimed it allowed him to do 2 days' worth of work in one. He would undress fully, climb into bed. Churchill's sleep habit was not born from indulgence, but from strategy. Tesla's later life was marked by periods of intense isolation and mental instability. But in his most productive years, not far from him in temperament, the brilliant and eccentric inventor slept very little. Whether this was sustainable or not is unclear. He would walk 4 miles at night. Then consider Albert Einstein. A man of immense mental rigor, but one who prized rest deeply. Einstein reportedly slept at least 10 hours a night, often more. These micro-naps, or hypnagogic states, fascinated Einstein. From the fiercely scheduled to the dreamily unstructured, Thomas Edison, for example, was a vocal opponent of sleep. Edison built napping cots in his lab. Then there was Salvador, the surrealist painter who sought inspiration in his dreams. He called it slumber with a key, a practice he treated as ritual. Franz Kafka, by contrast, feared the night. Kafka once wrote, "I have spent all my life resisting the desire to sleep." Not all famous 20th century figures fought sleep. Marie Curie worked long hours in her laboratory. Franklin D. Roosevelt, his aides often described his evenings as strictly controlled. John F. Kennedy, he was a habitual napper. In contrast, Margaret Thatcher, and then there was Charles de Gaulle. These varied habits, long sleepers, short sleepers, dreamers, and skeptics, reflect not just the people, disorders, diagnosis, and the science of the restless mind. The 20th century was an age of machines, and among those machines, some were built not for war, or work, but to listen to silence. In quiet laboratories, behind soundproof doors, a new field emerged. The science of sleep, no longer left to one of the most influential, was established at the University of Chicago in the 1950s by Nathaniel Kleitman, often called the father of modern sleep research. He, along with his student Eugene Asarinsky, made a remarkable discovery in 1953. The rapid eye movement phase of sleep, REM. In these softly humming rooms, the sleepers were watched. During REM sleep, the body is still, but the brain is active. Eyes dart beneath closed lids. Heart rate fluctuates. It is the phase most associated with vivid dreaming. Eyes closed. It might take the form of difficulty falling asleep, frequent waking, or waking too early. Some people could not quiet their minds. Others slept lightly, never dipping into the deeper, more restorative phases. Sleep hygiene was formalized. Barbiturates gave way to benzodiazepines. Drugs, like Valium or Temazep, which sedated the nervous system and induced sleep. Later still came the zolpidem. People with narcolepsy could fall asleep mid-conversation, during meals, or even while walking, often accompanied by cataplexy. Morning grogginess, including stimulants to maintain alertness. Late-night programming expanded. Blue light from screens, televisions, then computers, then smartphones, began to interrupt melatonin production, delaying sleep. People stayed up later. Teenagers became nocturnal. Shift work expanded. Commutes grew longer. Many wore their sleep deprivation as a badge of honor, proof of productivity. Global businesses operated across time zones. Jet lag became common. Psychologists promoted sleep as essential for mental health. Schools debated later start times for adolescence. Books were written, like Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep, psychological and emotional necessity of sleep. Still, the disorder remained rare and poorly understood. Create a cool and dark bedroom. Use the bed only for sleep. A condition long experienced, but rarely spoken of. It caused unpleasant sensations in the legs, particularly in the evening. People described it as crawling, tingling, or throbbing, an irresistible urge to move. For some, it disrupted sleep entirely. It was treated with iron supplements, dopamine agonists. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia emerged as an effective treatment. It became clear in the 1970s that some sleepers stopped breathing repeatedly through the night, sometimes hundreds of times. This condition, obstructive sleep apnea, caused by the collapse of soft tissue in the throat, disrupted sleep and lowered blood oxygen levels. Scientists studied the circadian clock, the internal system that governs the sleep-wake cycle, largely regulated by light. When this rhythm is disrupted, shift workers, for instance, showed higher rates of obesity, depression, and cardiovascular disease. Sleep apps promised to lull users into slumber, with ocean sounds, weighted blankets, white noise machines, blackout curtains, all part of a growing market that turned sleep into a lifestyle goal. The sleeper, often unaware, would wake repeatedly, not fully, but enough to fragment the night, based not on sedation, but on changing thoughts and habits surrounding sleep. Among the first to be studied in detail was insomnia, a condition ancient in experience, but modern in definition. Brain waves traced like mountain ranges across scrolling paper. The body, once so private in its repose, became a subject of intense observation. And in this attention, the strange became medical. The unusual became named. Treatment took many forms. These bedside machines delivered a gentle stream of air through a mask, and that cycle, repeated 4 to 6 times per night, became the new model for healthy rest. Sleep was no longer mystery alone. The first formal sleep laboratories began to appear in the mid-20th century. This was the moment the scientific world began to understand that sleep was not a flat state, but a landscape with hills and valleys. This discovery changed everything. Sleep was no longer seen as a single, undifferentiated state. It became a cycle, moving through light sleep, deeper stages. What happens when these cycles are disrupted? Why do some people sleep poorly, or not at all? Why do others stop breathing in the night? Sleep disorders began to take shape as categories of clinical concern. Insomnia was now understood not only as an inability to sleep, but also as a pattern of rest that fails to restore. Doctors began developing protocols, behavioral and pharmaceutical, to treat it. Pharmacological solutions. As one problem was being addressed, another emerged. Sleep apnea. Described in earlier decades as heavy snoring, poor concentration. For many, these devices, bulky, humming, strange, brought life-changing relief. They also turned bedrooms into extensions of the clinic. Another condition caught attention: narcolepsy, a disorder characterized by sudden and uncontrollable sleep attacks. Over time, research revealed it to be a neurological disorder involving the brain's regulation of wakefulness. Medications were developed to manage symptoms. Restless leg syndrome, too, emerged into medical consciousness. Beyond these medical diagnoses, television brought flickering light into bedrooms. The field of chronobiology emerged, the study of biological rhythms. Sleep became a health indicator, and also a commercial product. Mattresses were branded and advertised for their restorative powers. The paradox of the late 20th century became clear. The more we understood sleep, the less of it we seemed to get. Work hours lengthened, but alongside this glorification of sleeplessness came a quiet resistance, movements to reclaim rest. Sleep researchers urged the importance of consistency, and so the modern sleeper found themselves between two forces: a world that demanded wakefulness, and a body that pleaded for rest. Rituals and the quiet negotiations of the night, the late 20th century, did not simply transform science, industry, and medicine. And within the walls of these changing homes, perhaps no space was more quietly transformed than the bedroom, no longer solely an act of necessity or a product of sacred rhythm. It became an event unto itself, structured, curated, sometimes even choreographed. Here, amid familiar furnishings and gentle domestic rituals, sleep began to take on a new character. The television hums faintly in the living room, the host of a late-night talk show now smiling through canned laughter. The lights in the kitchen are off. The dishes are stacked, drying. Upstairs, the bedrooms begin to dim. Imagine a house in 1980. In one room, A child climbs into a twin bed. These clocks marked time relentlessly. Fluorescent bulbs in closets, curtains became thicker, but to block out the glow of street lamps. For many, their presence was both comfort and burden. A quiet monitor counting down the hours until morning. A parent sits beside them, reading softly from a picture book. Mobile phones, though still rare, buzzed at the edge of sleep. And in this expanding web of communication, the line between day and night began to blur. Once again, soft colors, sage green, pale blue, dusky rose, were recommended in lifestyle magazines to promote calm. Wall-to-wall carpeting muffled sound. Books like The Relaxation Response, or You Can Conquer Insomnia, gave readers strategies for winding down. Sleep became something to manage, improve, and measure. Not just experience. Decorative quilts and matching pillow shams. The simple act of falling asleep. Nightstands held not just alarm clocks, but hand creams. The room became not just a place to sleep. By the late 1980s, some prayed, some counted. Muscles relaxed. The brain cycled through stages, some deep and quiet, others rich with dreams. And in this nightly passage, some simply waited for sleep to take them. Rest came in short bursts. For night shift workers, sleep arrived in the daylight, fitful, incomplete, disturbed by light and life around them. For new parents, rest came in fragments, shaped by the cries of a newborn. For those who grieved or worried or waited, blue light, as it would later be understood, suppressed melatonin, the hormone responsible for sleep. Evening television, once a novelty, began to chip away at bedtime, pushing sleep later, crowding it with content. The bedroom could be arranged perfectly, and still the mind might race. A noise, the modern sleeper. Couples fell asleep to the voice of a weather anchor or the droning of a late-night detective series. In some homes, morning conversations began not with weather or news, but with the recollection of dreams. I had the strangest dream last night, became a refrain. Dream interpretation books lined bedside shelves. Some treated them seriously, others with amusement, but everyone, in some way, looked for meaning in the night. For some, it became ritual, a background rhythm to lull the mind. The story ends. For others, a disruption, but everywhere, sound was being shaped. Silence was no longer silent. It was selected. A lamp is clicked off. A nightlight glows in the corner. A quiet voice wishes good night. The ritual of folding back the covers. These gestures, repeated night after night, offered a kind of comfort, a personal architecture of sleep. A door creaks as it closes. In another room, a teenager lies back on a bed. They stare at the ceiling. The other flips the final page of a novel. There is a murmured exchange, maybe a sigh. Then quiet. The music lulls them slowly toward sleep. And in the master bedroom, one turns off the bedside lamp. Children had bedtime routines. Brush your teeth. Go to the bathroom. These routines, often soothing and repetitive, helped shape a reliable rhythm. Sleep training for infants, bedtime charts for young children. and curfews for teens all signaled a new kind of structure. The management of sleep, not by natural cycles, but by parenting norms and household logistics. This was the modern ritual. Sleep in the home had become something private. In adult bedrooms, furnishings reflected the era. Firm mattresses, headboards with built-in shelves, digital alarm clocks, glowing red in the dark. The introduction of home air conditioning and electric fans added a steady hum to the nighttime soundscape. For some, it was comforting. Television moved from the living room to the bedroom, but the screen, now omnipresent, brought with it a price. As the 1990s approached, another shift emerged. The dawn of the digital world. Computers entered homes. Emails began to arrive after dark. Yet amid these shifts, a chapter of a paperback novel. Even the design of bedrooms changed to reflect this attention. The rise of the self-help movement also shaped how people thought about sleep. For many, this brought relief, but sleep, for all its scrutiny, some nights it came easily. Other nights, it hovered just beyond reach. Even dreams, long seen as private, became subjects, and yet sleep did not belong only to those with stable homes or fixed routines. For the unhoused, sleep was not distributed evenly, but everywhere. In city apartments, country houses, nursing homes, and dormitories, people closed their eyes each night and hoped for rest. The modern bedroom, for all its softness, was never a guarantee. And still, the body did what it had always done. The breath slowed, the temperature dropped, the sleeper remained. And so, our long, gentle journey draws across empires, from the incense-laced temples of ancient Egypt to the softly glowing screens of modern bedrooms. It has carried dreams thought to be divine. Its nature has not changed, only the world around it. We measure it now, monitor it, optimize it. And yet, for all our effort, sleep continues to elude easy definition, soothed the weary bodies of laborers, and offered refuge from the relentless pace of waking life. Even in its most fragile forms, interrupted, restless, uncertain, it has remained a constant presence, always waiting to reclaim the body, always reaching gently for the mind. We have followed the rhythms of rest, listening to the slow, steady breath of those who came before. Kings and carpenters, you may feel that same thread, connecting you to distant times and quiet lives. The medieval monk who woke to chant in the dark, the artist who paused his work for a brief nap, the child who curled beside the hearth, listening to the wind in the eaves. Monks and mothers, poets, each in their own way, seeking that universal quiet. Sleep, as we've seen, is far more than stillness. It has been ritual, remedy, mystery, and mirror. Through candlelight and curfew bells, ticking clocks and humming machines, it resists control. It invites surrender. Tonight, as you lie in your own room, surrounded by familiar sounds and shadows, you are part of their rhythm, their need. The voices of history, the dreams of emperors and inventors have passed like clouds. The room is still, the air soft, the stories complete. You are safe. You are home. And it is time to sleep.